So who is the devil and Satan? Well, be probably a fair assumption to say that pretty much everyone, religious and non-religious, has heard of the devil and or Satan. Even people use it in their daily speech when they're talking about, might be talking about a tricky problem, which they might describe as a devil of a problem and other things like that. But our title for tonight is quite specific, isn't it? It's defining who is the devil and Satan. It's when we come to define the devil and Satan that it gets a little harder. There's all sorts of differing opinions. If you were to say just people will draw what it is you think the devil is, you come across these kind of pictures. In fact, that's just a plain Google Images search for the devil. And there's sort of quite fantastical creatures in some ways, aren't they? There's sort of some similar characteristics, apparently. They all seem to have horns. They've all, or at least these two, have sort of got a degree of hairiness associated with them. There's, chains and bat wings and tails featuring. Interestingly enough, this, fire and flames, darkness. And we might say, well, who cares? Who cares? One person's opinion of the devil, pictorially represented, is their opinion, and someone else's is someone else's. But the Bible is very clear how important this subject is. It's critical. A correct understanding of the devil is essential. And there's a big statement here, isn't it? The purpose of Jesus' purpose was to destroy the devil and its works. How do we know that? We'll have a look at a couple of quotes that show us that. 1 John chapter 3, verse 8. He that committeth sin is of the devil, for the devil sinneth from the beginning. For this purpose, the Son of God was manifested, that he might destroy the works of the devil. So you say, well, if that was Jesus' purpose, we sort of need to understand what the devil is that he destroyed. Here's another one. Exactly the same sentiments. This is how important this subject is. Hebrews 2, verse 14. For as much then as the children are partakers of flesh and blood, he, that's talking about Jesus, you can see that clearly in the context there, he, Jesus, also himself likewise took part of the same. Now here comes that same expression, here comes the same importance of this subject, that through death he might destroy him that had the power of death, that is the devil. So before we even understand, before we've even defined what the devil is, before we've worked our way through that, you have to say, you can see clearly from those quotes, that it's pretty important that we understand what the devil is, because that was the purpose of Jesus, to come and destroy the devil and its works. And that's what we aim to do. Now, we do have limited time, so there's going to be information, there's going to be quotes that we are not going to be able to get to at all. But what we hope to do tonight is to be able to take you on sufficient of a journey to show what we believe the clear biblical understanding of the devil is. But before we do that, let's see what we might term as the mainstream sort of Christian, could perhaps be called orthodox, understanding of the devil and Satan is. So I hasten to add that we don't believe that this is the correct understanding, but this is, generally speaking, what we might term mainstream Christian understanding about the devil and Satan. And that is, as some of you will recognise from the font, that comes straight from Wikipedia. So if you put in devil into Wikipedia, you'll see this particular excerpt. I'm not going to read it all out, but a few key points. So in Christianity, evil is incarnate, dwelling in, the devil or Satan, a fallen angel who is the primary opponent of God, says the mainstream Christian understanding of the devil and Satan. Second paragraph, Christianity describes Satan as a fallen angel who terrorises the world through evil. It's the antithesis, the opposite of truth, and shall be condemned together with the fallen angels who follow him to eternal fire at the last judgment. In mainstream Christianity, the devil is usually referred to as Satan. And then there's a bit which, we would also challenge in terms of its validity, but this is because Christian beliefs in Satan are inspired directly by the dominant view of Second Temple Judaism as expressed practice by Jesus. We don't believe that, but with some minor variations. So the point is, the mainstream Christian understanding of the devil and Satan is that the devil, which is the same as Satan, is this being, this opponent, a fallen angel, someone who is opposed to truth, the antithesis of truth, and someone who will be condemned. But there's some problems with this understanding. And these problems go like this. If you see this being, this incarnate being that is everything to do with evil, if that's an immortal being, i.e. non-dying being, then we have a bit of a problem, isn't it? So the concept of an immortal devil is in direct conflict with some key quotes that appear in the Bible. And we're going to be using one of those key quotes. You saw it before on our screen from Hebrews chapter 2, verse 14. It was on a couple of slides ago. We're going to have a look at this quote in a bit more detail shortly. But you may remember it. Hebrews 2 verse 14 said that the devil was destroyed through the work, and particularly the death, of Jesus. So if the devil's an immortal being, we've got a problem, don't we? Because Jesus' purpose, remember that slide? Jesus' purpose, this is how important it was, is to destroy the devil. And we know that Jesus was successful in the purpose that God sent him for. So that doesn't work when we have an immortal devil. It's also inconsistent with the biblical statement, 1 Timothy chapter 6, which says that only God has immortality. So that's one of the first sort of fundamental problems with the mainstream Christian understanding of the devil and Satan. So if you say, well, okay, maybe the devil's not immortal. Instead, maybe the devil is mortal, i.e. dying. But that's a problem, isn't it? How can God, and we know a lot about God, revealed in the words of the Bible, how can God allow a mortal being to have supernatural power to cause all the things that this devil is accused of causing? Disease, death, deception of innocent people. I mean, that's inconsistent with God. And we've got a quote here from Nehemiah chapter 9, verse 6. Thou, even thou, the Lord alone, thou hast made heaven, the heaven of heavens, with all their hosts, the earth, all things that are therein. The sea, he goes on to describe. Thou preservest them all. The host of heaven worshipeth thee. So we've got this picture from Nehemiah, consistent with many other quotes, that God's in control. God's creation that he has established is working in harmony with what God wants. The host of heaven is worshipping him. So the concept of an immortal devil's got problems in terms of it being the fundamental thing that Jesus came to destroy. The concept of a mortal devil's got problems because that's inconsistent with how the Bible describes God's work. And then there's other problems as well, is that if the devil exists, why is there no clear definition or description of him? We saw before, people come up with ideas. Some people think he's red, horns, pointy tail. We know lots about God. The scriptures are full of his characteristics, the fact that we're made in the image of God. But there's nothing that defines or describes this devil. Interestingly, and we're going to have a look at this in just a little minute, there's no basis for the concept of a supernatural being or supernatural devil or an incarnate being in the Old Testament. We're going to have a look at all the references to devil that appear in the Old Testament, and that is quite apparent. And the problems keep coming. Look at our reading that we had for that Eden read for us this morning. God holds individuals accountable for their sins. That came through, doesn't it? Read those bits. Every man is tempted when he's drawn away of his own lusts. This is verse 14 of James chapter 1. And enticed. Then when lust hath conceived, it brings forth sin, and sin, when it is finished, brings forth death. And God says, you are accountable. The source of sin is the human mind. We've got those quotes. The first one is what we just read before in our reading here. Every man's tempted when he's drawn away of his own lust and enticed. And there's Jeremiah 17 verse 9. This isn't just a New Testament concept in terms of the accountability, the individual accountability for our sins. In Jeremiah, the same principle is clear, isn't it? The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? Now, if the devil was an incarnate being of evil, be it mortal or immortal, it doesn't actually matter, but if there was this being that was the incarnation of evil, wouldn't the Bible say the devil is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked? It would, wouldn't it? Such a clear quote. If ever you wanted a clear quote to define and distinguish this devil as an incarnate being, that would be it, but it doesn't say that. It's the heart. The heart. And that fits with James, doesn't it? Don't blame someone else when we're drawn away of our own lust and enticed. And the end result of that process is sin. And in fact, we'd say, well, okay, that's James. Maybe he was a bit wrong. Jeremiah, maybe he didn't get it right. Well, let's look at what Jesus says. He's going to get it right, isn't it? I mean, we know the others are right as well, just to clarify that. But look what Jesus says. That which cometh out of the man, that defileth the man. For from within, out of the heart of man, proceed evil thoughts, adulteries, fornications, murders, thefts, covetousness, wickedness, deceit, lasciviousness, an evil eye, blasphemy, pride, foolishness. I mean, you might think, oh, I don't even know what some of those words mean, but they're bad words, aren't they? They're things that are not good. They're the epitome of the things that are either selfish or self-centred or against other people or causing grief or opposed to God. All those things, and what does Jesus say about all those things? All these evil things come from within and defile the man. That's pretty clear, isn't it? It's pretty clear. Again, if the truth was somehow this external incarnate body of evil, this being that was somehow evil and tempting people, this is where Jesus should say it. But he doesn't. He clearly says that those evil things, evil thinking that leads to evil practice, comes from within, out of the heart, which is just what Jeremiah said, wasn't it? Heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. It's what James says, that we're drawn away of our own lust. So you can see these things, and the problems go on. I've only put 6 of them here, but we'll see that there's others as we work our way through it. The Bible states that only God's will is performed in heaven. Does anyone know what that quote there, Matthew 6 verse 10, is commonly part of? Well, not commonly, it is part of, something that's commonly known. These guys down the front are looking particularly wise. Matthew 6, words of Lord Jesus Christ. Yes, yeah, and particularly Sermon on the Mount, but particularly the Lord's Prayer. You remember the Lord's Prayer? Our Father which art in heaven. Our Father which art in heaven. Hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Now, when Jesus is teaching the disciples to pray, it's not saying, actually, the wills didn't work out too well because there's all sort of rebellion and stuff and we want that on earth. No, he's saying thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven, because that's a place where nothing but good is. God's will is performed there. And this idea that we saw in Wikipedia, where the sort of mainstream Christian understanding talks about this rebellion in heaven, is totally inconsistent with that. How can God lose control? Creator of all things in heaven. How could he How could he lose control? He can't. The Bible has no place for God to lose control. So, okay, you might be sitting there thinking, fair enough. I understand what the mainstream Christian perspective is, and I can see that, okay, there's a few challenges with that. But what is the devil then? Because the Bible's full of it, isn't it? You can search through and look up and you come across the word devil over and over and over again, and Satan for that matter. So what are you saying, you might ask, is the devil? Well, the Christadelphian understanding of the devil, which we believe to be the biblical and correct understanding of the devil, is at it really, at its base level, very, very simple. The devil is a personification of human, natural, selfish inclinations. Lusts is the term the Bible uses, it just means strong feelings, which lead to sins against God. So the devil's a personification. We're going to circle back in a minute and have a look at what that means, this idea of a personification. So it's a personification of human, natural, selfish inclinations or lusts, which lead to sins against God. Now that fits, doesn't it? Right at the get-go, that fits with some of the things that we've been looking at. That fits with James. Every man drawn away of his own lusts and enticed, then when those lusts, those desires conceive, they bring forth sin, and sin, when it's finished, brings forth death. That makes sense, isn't it? Human, natural, selfish inclinations. The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Human, natural, selfish inclinations. Not that which comes out of a man defiles the man, says Jesus. From within, out of the heart of man, proceed evil thoughts, adultery, so on and so forth. List them all off. All these things come from within. So, in that context, this personification of human, natural, selfish inclinations which leads to sins against God, there's a few usages of that. One of them is it describes the general human condition, we might describe that. But it applies the situation, the natural state that applies to all human beings. Now, I've got a few quotes here, so to jot them down, please, but I'll put them up on the screen just so, not all of them, but just one of each of these quotes, just to emphasise the point. So this is where we swing back to Hebrews 2:14. Now think about Hebrews 2 verse 14, the words of speaking about the purpose of Jesus Christ in the context of this. Oh, it makes so much sense, doesn't it? So clear, so clear. For as much then as the children, humanity, are partakers of flesh and blood, natural human condition, Jesus also himself took part of the same, that through death he might destroy those natural selfish inclinations or lusts that have the power of death. How powerful is that? The quotes make sense. The work of Jesus makes sense. We're going to circle back in a bit more detail in just a minute to have a look at Hebrews chapter 2 verse 14 in more detail. We're going to see the more we look into it, the more it makes sense that this is what the devil is referring to. But let's just continue this piece here. So the devil can be used to describe the general human condition. It can also be used to describe specifically individuals who are ruled by their lusts. So they're actually really the same thing in many respects, aren't they? One of them talks about sort of the general condition of, we might call it selfishness that humans have, self-centeredness. But then particular individuals, when they are ruled by those lusts, when they allow them free rein, we might say, then they are also specifically recorded as being impacted, or being, in this case, a devil. So this is, again, the words of Jesus. John 6. Jesus speaking to the disciples, "Have not I chosen you 12? You may recall that there were 12 disciples that Jesus had. So these are his special followers. He's talking to them. It's only him and them. And he says, I've chosen you 12. And one of you is a devil. Now, he's clearly not talking about some incarnate being, be it supernatural or mortal, is it? He's not talking about someone that's got red, shaggy hair and ginormous horns and a pointy tail. But he's pretty clear. Of the 12 disciples, one of you is a devil. Now, the beauty is, the Bible actually now goes on to define what he's talking about. He spake of Judas Iscariot. I'm sure everyone's heard of Judas Iscariot, the disciple that betrayed Jesus. Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon, for he it was that should betray Jesus, being one of the 12. So in this context, while all the disciples had this, we might describe this general human condition, which generally speaking is described in the Bible as the devil that Jesus' purpose was to destroy, when individuals such as Judas Iscariot, when they're particularly ruled by their lusts by that, when it's a strong demonstration, as it was in Judas' case, he was benefiting financially from this transaction, then he specifically is described as a devil. Can you see how that sort of works? There's a general perspective, general human condition, and there's a specific application when people are allowing themselves to be driven by that general human condition and exercise those lusts. But there's also a third way that this devil can be used and is used in the Bible. And it's the wider scope. It's describing systems, social, political, religious, false religious, we hasten to add, where those systems, be they just political or quasi-religious, where the decisions that are made on the basis of that same reasoning, natural, human, selfish reasoning. Then the system becomes the devil. So I've got a neat little quote here from 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 8. Make sure you're jotting these quotes down as well, not just the ones I'm putting up there, but the others, because the others re-emphasise the same points. But you look at this. This is a letter that Peter, the Apostle Peter, wrote, and he's writing to people who are experiencing incredible persecution. So they're believers, first century believers, and they're suffering persecution. And he says to them, be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary, the devil, see there he is, adversary the devil, as a roaring lion, walketh about seeking whom he may devour. Now, who's he talking about? Well, I've sort of given the answer on the screen. But it's very clear what he's talking about. The pagan Roman Empire. At this time, with the preaching of Jesus' work going to all the Roman world and various groups of believers being established everywhere, not surprisingly, the pagan Roman system didn't appreciate that, and it's trying to stamp it out. Like a roaring lion, walking about, trying to devour this growing group of Jesus followers. And Peter writes to them, and he says, it's going to be tough because you have an adversary, the devil. Not referring to some incarnate being with a pointy tail. It's a system, in this case a political system. A system that persecuted believers. And why were they that way? Well, because as a system, in this, the pagan Roman Empire, as a system, they were driven by those same human, natural, selfish inclinations. So you can sort of see the point, I hope, that the usage of devil throughout the Bible can describe the general human condition that applies to us all naturally by reason of our birth, to particular individuals who allow that themselves to be ruled by those natural inclinations, and to systems where decisions are made on those same basics. But fundamentally, the same part applies across the whole lot, doesn't it? It's where we have human, natural, selfish inclinations which are driving us against God. Now, you might say, hang on. When I read about the devil, it sounds like a person. You know, the devil, he walks here, or he does this or that. But the idea of personification in the Bible is not at all unusual. So what does personification mean? I think this came from the Oxford Dictionary, actually, this definition here. It's the attribution of a personal character or a human characteristic to something that's non-human, or the representation of an abstract quality in human form. So what does that mean? Well, the Bible has many instances of personification. Anyone up for some questions? What do you reckon? Anyone think of some examples of personification? So it's the attribution of a personal nature or a human characteristic to something that's not human. Wisdom. Wisdom's a good one. Wisdom's good. Now, everyone agree wisdom is not a human, not a being. Yep, good. Thanks, Kit. Good man. It's not. I'll get you in just a second because you look like you've got another one. Happy's the man that findeth wisdom, says Proverbs 3. She is more precious than rubies. All the things our canst desire not to be compared unto her. Is wisdom a woman? Literally? No. But it's a personification. Why? Because there's characteristics of wisdom that help us to understand the point that, in this case, Solomon, the writer of Proverbs, is trying to make. Wisdom's like a wise mother guiding her children. We get that. We can picture a mother guiding children and teaching them. Well, that's the point that Solomon's trying to make. So you personify it. You're trying to use human characteristics for a non-human object to be able to enhance the understanding of what it is you're talking about. Did you have another one? Yeah.
God is love.
God is love. Yes. Yep, I haven't got that one on my list here, but same concepts. Yes. Any others? I'll give you a clue. You can have a look at it while we're waiting. There's one in James chapter 1. But while you're looking for that, sin and grace is personified. They're described like they're two opposite kind of rulers, kings. See this? As sin hath reigned unto death. Well, you can search all the lists of kings of all the nations. You ain't going to find one called King Sin. But the Bible makes a point. It's like a king reigning. And the contrast to King Sin, we might say, is King Grace. Even so might grace reign. See, the Bible uses this idea of personification. Did anyone find the one from James 1? Yes, patience. I haven't actually got that one up here. As Eden was reading, I thought, here's another example, because this isn't an exhaustive list here. But patience, where was that one, Jemima? Verse 4. Let patience have her perfect work. See, there you go. There's another personification, this idea of patience as a woman. And again, you can understand why. And you see, so go, this God's Spirit. God's Spirit will guide you in all truth. Even the nation of Israel is described like that, described as a virgin of Israel. Is that because the nation of Israel is literally a single virgin? No, but the idea of this pure virgin who's about to be, espoused to a husband, which is God, is so much more powerful when you personify the idea. You can see, even though God's talking about his relationship with the nation of Israel. And the list goes on. What's the point? The point they were trying to make is personification is a common biblical mechanism for emphasising characteristics that God wants us to understand. And the idea of the devil is a personification of that natural human thinking, whether it's manifested just in our natural general condition that applies to us all as humans, whether it's manifested in an individual who is particularly selfish and driven by that, or whether it's manifested in systems that are driven and motivated by those same natural selfish thoughts. And because it's personified, we can picture it, we can understand the point that God's trying to make. So, one of the points we made at the start was that the Old Testament has absolutely no references which can even lead to a concept of this sort of supernatural or being, this incarnate being of evil. And there's only four references to devils, so I'll go through this pretty quickly, but again, one of the things you're trying to do is make sure you're marking stuff in. There's some quotes here. You'll see a little one here, and if I go like this, you'll see what that word means. And you can see that out of the four quotes that refer to devils, and there are only four references, two of them are this English word here. This Hebrew word here. Right? As I'm sure you all know, the Old Testament primarily written in Hebrew, the New Testament written in Greek, the original. So if we were to go and look up what in English is translated as devils, we would find that it's the Hebrew word here, Seir. And what it actually means is shaggy, like a he-goat or a fawn. That's interesting, isn't it? What's that talking to? What's that referring to? Actually, in passing, do you remember those pictures that we saw on the first slide? What's this devil? Did you notice that it's shaggy and it had horns, goat horns actually? And in fact, I didn't point it out, but one of them was shown as goat feet. The reason for that is because these people that made up those pictures, and they are only made up, they looked at this Hebrew word and they thought, maybe it's like a little bit like a goat. But it's not talking about a being. Just read the verse. The verse explains itself. So the first one, Leviticus 17, they, talking about the nation of Israel, they shall no more offer their sacrifices unto devils after whom they have gone a whoring. This shall be a statute forever throughout their generations. What was Israel's problem? They served the gods, the idols, the false gods of the nations around them. And the false gods of the nations around them were gods that were made to look like objects that people could recognise. Shapes of animals, for example. And here God says, no more. No more sacrifices unto those gods. You see it again in 2 Chronicles chapter 11, verse 15. It's talking about Jeroboam. Again, if you know anything about Jeroboam, you know that he was a part of Israel. He did understand the true worship of the God of Israel, as recorded in the Old Testament. But for political reasons, he set up a false worship. And this is what he did. Jeroboam ordained him priests for the high places, and for the devils, and for the calves which he had made. That's not an incarnate being. It's something that Jeroboam made. He made them. What were they? They're just false idols. They're just worthless gods, so far as any divinity is concerned. They're just objects that look like the objects that are around them. So those references in the Old Testament to devils are clearly referring to the gods of the nations around them. And this one is same. Now you'll notice here, these are the other two references where the English word devil is used in the Old Testament, at least as translated in the King James Version. And you can see here that it's a slightly different Hebrew word. Shade, I think is how you pronounce that word. When it says they sacrifice unto devils, not to God, to gods whom they knew not. They sacrifice their sons and daughters unto devils. It's a slightly different word. It's not that shaggy goat type concept of the other word. It's this one here. And we might say, ha, here it is. Reference to some sort of nasty thing. Malignant, that means nasty. Surely this is referring to some sort of incarnate being of evil. No, it's not. No, it's not. Well, we're going to see it's nasty. But again, it's just false gods. They sacrifice unto devils, not to gods whom they knew not. Why is this Hebrew word used? Because those false gods were terrible. Not the God themselves, but the practices of them. Children literally sacrificed. So they would heat up this sort of false god altar thing and then place their children in this burning hot arms of this altar. Screams, imagine that, screams, and describes the drums beating as they did it. That's why the word malignant's used. Terrible. But ultimately, it's not talking about an incarnate being. The issue with the false gods, and Hezekiah, King Hezekiah, great king of Israel, in 2 Kings chapter 16, verse 3, it says that his father passed his sons, including Hezekiah, through that fire to Molech. Nasty, but it wasn't the work of some separate, incarnate evil. It was the selfish, natural reasoning, self-centered thinking of Hezekiah's father and those around him. From within, out of the heart of man, come all those evil things that Jesus spoke about before. So you can see how clear it is, The references are just referring to false idols that the nation of Israel followed. When we come to the New Testament, there's basically 4 Greek words that are used. As we said, Old Testament largely written in Hebrew, New Testament in Greek. So there's 4 words. And you can sort of see one of them, diabolos, and then there's others, daimon. You can see the similarity. They all sort of centre around this word here, which we're not really going to touch on tonight. And typically, these words are translated in our Bible as demons. And I said I wasn't going to talk about it, now I inevitably do, but in the context of people having diseases, usually, either mental diseases or even physical diseases. But what we're going to do is we're going to concentrate on the main word that's used in the New Testament that is translated as devil. And it's this Greek word, diabolos. So if you look up Strong's, many of you will be familiar with that, a Hebrew and Greek lexicon, dictionary. It says that this word diabolos means a traducer. Traducer, what does that mean? Does anyone know what it means? We'll see in a minute. And it also goes on to say, now remember this is just someone who had an idea of the devil and Satan that was aligned with mainstream Christianity. Strong's links this diabolos to Satan. And we're going to see that there's actually a difference between the two. I'm dealing with the devil at the moment, but we're going to swing on to Satan shortly. So what is this word diabolos? Well, the Greek word diabolos is actually made up of 2 words, dia and balo. And we get dia, don't we? Diameter. I'm suddenly running short of Greek words, but there's many, many other words that use the Greek dia. I'm sure I could think of them if I had a few more minutes. But at least diameter is the idea. So it means through, because the diameter goes through a circle. And it's got this idea of to strike or stab with accusation. And here's where that idea of traduce comes in, to defame, to malign. So the Greek word diabolos really means to be a false accuser. You're defaming, you're maligning, you're traducing, you're stabbing someone with accusation. Well, surely that sounds like an evil incarnate being, doesn't it? Striking and stabbing with accusation. Remember we said that the Bible's translated from the original Hebrew in the Old Testament and Greek in the New Testament. And the problem is that sometimes when the translators have a bias to believing certain things, they can be inconsistent in the way that they translate those Greek words in the New Testament, similarly in the Hebrew ones. They've got in their mind what they think the Bible should be saying, and they can't help themselves but translate it accordingly. But if we were to go back, we would see that in actual fact, that word diabolos is used in quite a variety of circumstances that have absolutely nothing whatsoever to even in any way be identified with this sort of being of incarnate evil. Have a look at this one. 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 1. Here's the Apostle Paul writing to Timothy, and he's giving a whole lot of advice And part of that advice that he gives is talking about the wives of people that are serving in these communities of believers. And he says, even so must their wives be grave, not slanderers, sober, faithful in all things. Now, we can understand that word slanderers, can't we? You know, you can't go around telling false accusations, maligning people. Well, what do you know? That's the word diabolos, translated as devil. Are their wives, is it saying, oh, by the way, we don't want your wife to be, you know, the devil incarnate? Of course not, of course not. The devil is a false accuser. Again, this time 2 Timothy 3 verse 3, talking about people that are living at the time of the last days, just before Jesus returns to the earth. And you see, this time it's another English translation again. The inconsistent translation. Here it's described as slanderers. 2 Timothy 3, talking about people without natural affection, truce breakers, false accusers, incontinent, fierce, despisers of those that are good. Diabolos. And similarly, there's another one in Titus, which is this time talking about aged women. So that's about the other extreme, isn't it? From this sort of idea of an evil being with, a pointy tail and horns. This is talking about the aged women. If they be in behaviours becomes holiness, not false accusers. So you can see here that this word, diabolos, even though it's translated as devil through the Bible, it's clearly, albeit inconsistently translated by the translators, it's clearly used to describe what people do and think, isn't it? You can be the most mild-mannered old lady, but if you're a false accuser, you're the devil. Just like Judas, when he betrayed Jesus, one of you is a devil. Just like the wives of leaders within the community there can't be slanderers, because they'd be a devil. See how it works? It's actually so simple. So simple. Let me move on, because I mentioned before we want to have a look at this Hebrews 2 verse 14. This is really the key to understanding the diabolos. Hebrews 2 verse 14 makes absolutely no sense if the devil is a powerful, evil being. I'll put it up there on the screen. All right, so Hebrews 2 verse 14. We've looked at it before. If the devil is a powerful, evil being, this quote, which at the end of the day describes the purpose of Jesus Christ. Why did Jesus come? That's a pretty fundamental question. Well, if the devil's a powerful, evil being, this sort of incarnate being, then that quote makes no sense. Why? Well, the first one. If the devil's a powerful, supernatural even being, why would coming in all our weakness destroy it? Like, surely if it's a powerful being, Jesus needed to come with swords and weapons and power and authority and immortality. That's the way you're going to destroy another powerful being. You've got to outpower that one. See how it works? But doesn't it? Jesus instead comes the opposite. Flesh and blood, weakness. And even more fundamentally, if this being was so powerful, how was it destroyed by Jesus' death? Surely this powerful being has triumphed if Jesus has died. You picture a normal battle that's occurring. The victor is the one that kills the other one, surely. But Hebrews 2 verse 14 says, through death, Jesus might destroy him that had the power of death. Doesn't make sense if the devil is a powerful, evil being. And this is pretty hard to get past, isn't it? Even if you can get past the first two, which I think would defy most logical, common sense rationale, what about this one? We know Jesus' mission was successful. This is my beloved Son, says God, in whom I'm well pleased. Hear him. He came and did what God wanted. So Jesus' mission is successful. Why is the devil still alive? Can't be, can he? Because Jesus' purpose was to destroy the devil. As we've seen before, the Bible is super clear that death is a consequence of sin. We saw that in those quotes, isn't it? When lust hath conceived, it brings forth sin. And sin, when it's finished, brings forth death. So the consequence that leads to death is sin, not some other being. And that's interesting, that he might destroy him that hath the power of death. The power of death. So if we can find out from the Bible what has the power of death, now we've got a little equation we can put together, can't we? Because the power of death in Hebrews 2 verse 14, Jesus says, equals the devil. So if we can find out from the Bible what has the power of death, then these two must be the same. Does that make sense? It's a logical explanation. Well, let's see what the Bible says. 1 Corinthians 15 verse 3. Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures. Through death, he might destroy them at the power of death. So here's an alignment. Christ dying through death. What for? For our sins. Because he's destroying him that has the power of death. And then look at this quote here. We looked at this one, didn't we? So this isn't a surprise. We started with this quote in James chapter 1. Every man's tempted when he's drawn away of his own lust and enticed, and with lust hath conceived, it bringeth forth sin. And sin, when it is finished, bringeth forth death. What's got the power of death? Sin. Now, our title, and I'm looking nervously at the clock here, our title said the devil and Satan. Now, so far, I've only been looking at the devil. So I'm going to spend just a little bit of time looking at Satan, and I'm going to try and bring it all to a close before we hit 7 o'clock. So that's my objective now. So we talked about the devil. What about Satan? Now, it's interesting, isn't it? Because that Wikipedia definition equated the two. It said the devil and Satan are the same. Did you notice that when it said it? Exactly the same. Even our lecture title probably implied it. But actually it's not the case. Because Satan is very different. And we'll see it can be the same, but it doesn't have to be. Actually the word Satan, so we go and look it up in Hebrew, we can see that's the Hebrew word. Because our English Satan is just a transliteration of that Hebrew word. So they've just brought across the Hebrew, Satan, into English. And what does it mean? An opponent. And again, you can see the bias of, in this case, Strong's, the Dr. Strong, who says it's the arch enemy of good. We're going to see that that is not correct. That definition is not correct. So let's have a little look at a few facts about where we find Satan in the Bible. The English word Satan occurs 56 times, so 19 of them in the Old Testament and 37 of them in the New Testament. Of the ones in the Old Testament, can you see an interesting little thing here? There's 19 times we get the English word Satan, but the Hebrew word Satan occurs 27 times. That's interesting, isn't it? See the difference between the two? So 27 times the Hebrew word Satan appears, but only 19 times do we get the English word Satan. Why? Because of the bias of the translators. 7 times it's translated in terms of its meaning as adversary or adversaries. Once it's translated as withstand. So what ends up happening is the translators read through certain sections and they are clear that clearly Satan's not referring to the Hebrew word Satan is not referring to some supernatural being or some incarnation of evil. So they use instead what the word Satan means, an opponent. And then there's other instances where they use the Hebrew word Satan as a noun. Does that make sense, what I'm saying? That's a little bit tricky. The translators are being a little free. They've got a bias in terms of what they believe, and they tend to use that bias becomes evident in the way that they translate the Bible. But the beauty is we can go and check for ourselves. You can look up and find all the instances of Satan, and you find some interesting things. Because there are good and bad Satans. That's different, isn't it? That's different from what Wikipedia said. That's different from what Dr. Strong said when he did his definition there. But you can see super clearly from the Bible that's the case. Let's have a look at the bad ones. They're bad when the will of God is opposed. So, for example, the evil thoughts of men. I'll just put up a quote to prove it. Acts 5. Instance of Ananias and Sapphira. They lied about a certain donation that they were going to make to the believers. Peter said, Ananias, why hath Satan filled thine heart to lie to the Holy Ghost, or the Holy Spirit, and keep back price of the land? Anyone know what happened to Ananias? Yeah, you know. Dead. Fell over dead. So Ananias ended up being held accountable, and we might say, this must be some supernatural being that's somehow twisting Ananias, and Ananias in all his innocence, he's been made to do something bad. Is that what it says? No, it's just what Ananias was thinking. Oh, I'd like everyone to think I was really generous. I'd like a bit of glory. You got an adversary, says Peter to Ananias. They're an adversary, opponent to God's way. And look at this, isn't this interesting? In this context, the Satan is the same as the devil, isn't it? Remember, that's what we found from the devil. The devil is those natural, human tendencies to exercise our own lusts. See how it's the same thing? Driven by man-centeredness, not God-centeredness. It can also be used about individuals who oppose people who are doing good. And here's a quote from Matthew 16. And this time he's referring to none other than the Apostle Peter, great man of faith. And what does Jesus say? Get thee behind me, Satan. He wasn't talking to some external, incarnate being. He was talking to Peter, the Apostle Peter. You're a Satan. Why? Because he's an offence, an opponent, an adversary. Why? Was Peter an adversary? In this instance, he was. He was challenging the words of Jesus, challenging Jesus, what Jesus was there to do. Because you're savouring not the things that be of God, but those that be of men. The Bible's so clear, so clear. So Peter, in that instance, is behaving like an opponent to God. And just like we saw in the context of the devil when we looked at it, exactly the same way, Satan can be used to describe when political and religious institutions, the world in general, is opposed to God, opposed to the will of God. And there's a quote. Paul speaking to the Thessalonians, I wanted to come to you once and again, but Satan hindered us. Why? Because he was held up because of opposition. He was held up because people were rioting when he was there. He was held up because of issues that he had getting to see, in this case, the believers in Thessalonica. So just like we saw with with the devil, Satan, this opponent, this adversary, is used as that personification of exactly the same things. The evil thoughts of men as general, individuals who oppose people that are doing good, and political systems. But this is the bit that often people miss, and this proves that it cannot be a direct correlation between Satan and this concept of the devil, which is only ever used in a bad context. And here's an interesting one, isn't it? God is described as Satan. These are parallel accounts of the same incident. Parallel accounts. Chronicles says, in 1 Chronicles 21 verse 1, Satan stood up against Israel and provoked David to number Israel. You go to 2 Samuel chapter 24 and you find out who the Satan was. It's the Lord. He moved David to go and number them. Why? Because God, in this instance, is opposing evil. Now, remember what did Satan mean? Opposer. Opposer. So, people that are demonstrating that against God are doing it in a bad context. But when they're working for God, they might be opposing, just like this next one, they're opposing people doing the wrong thing. So the angel that stood, again, you may be familiar with the incident of Balaam, who's on his donkey and he's moving down and he's desperate to get his mittens into the riches of the Moabites. And an angel goes and stands in the way for, here's one of the times that the translators changed that, the Hebrew word Satan, adversary. See, they changed it to represent its meaning as opposed to a noun, but it's exactly the same. It's just being sneaky with the translation. So here's the angel as a Satan against Balaam. Why? Because he's doing something in opposition to Balaam, who was heading down a path of evil. And there's another example there. This instance is an interesting one. This time they describe, again, the words translated into adversary, but they translate it because it's talking about David, King David. See, was he an evil incarnate? Absolutely not. Man after God's own heart, the Bible describes him as. But so far as the Philistines were concerned, he would have been, had he been allowed to continue in that particular battle, an opponent to them. So, Satan can be used, it's just an adversary, an opponent. And it can be used to describe people motivated for bad, just like we saw in the case of the meaning, the personification of the devil, and it can be used in a context of good. Now, I am out of time, so I'm going to bring it to an end with a quick summary. This is an important subject. Having a correct understanding about the devil is important. Remember, it's why he came. We can only understand Jesus Christ's mission if we understand what he was to destroy. That's obvious, isn't it? That's stating the obvious. If that's why he came, that's his purpose, we pretty well need to make sure we understand who the devil is, or what the devil is, to be more precise. And what is it? Well, the devil's not a powerful evil being, as understood by that mainstream Christianity perspective. It is a personification of human, natural, selfish inclinations, which the Bible describes as lusts. And those inclinations lead to sin against God. God holds individuals accountable for their sins. Satan is a Hebrew word inconsistently transliterated into English, which confuses the meaning of the original text. Satan means an adversary or an opponent, and this is important. To the extent that our natural selfish inclinations are an adversary to our godly behaviour, the devil is a Satan. But there are examples of good and bad Satans, depending entirely on what is being opposed. And that's where we're going to bring it to an end for tonight. And I guess you'd say, well, that's great, but so what? The so what piece is, we're just giving you the theoretical, an overview. The reality is, the work that Jesus came to do has direct, powerful, and everlasting implications to our future. And certainly encourage all of you to take the time to truly work and understand what did it mean when Jesus came to perform God's will and to destroy the devil, as recorded for us in Hebrews 2:14.